Part 3 of an episode of Fiddletown, in Selected Stories by Bret Harte. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Jeff Cowgill. Selected Stories by Bret Harte. An episode of Fiddletown. Part 3. Heaven forfend that I should use a pen that should be ever dedicated to an exposition of unalterable moral principle to transcribe Mrs. Tretherick's own theory of this interval and episode, with its feeble palliations, its illogical deductions, its fond excuses, and weak apologies. It would seem, however, that her experience had been hard. Her slender stock of money was soon exhausted. At Sacramento she found that the composition of verse, although appealing to the highest emotions of the human heart, and compelling the editorial breast to the noblest commendation in the editorial pages, was singularly inadequate to defray the expenses of herself and Carrie. Then she tried the stage, but failed signally. Possibly her conception of the passions was different from that which obtained with the Sacramento audience, but it was certain that her charming presence, so effective at short range, was not sufficiently pronounced for the footlights. She had admirers enough in the green room, but awakened no abiding affection among the audience. In this strait it occurred to her that she had a voice, a contralto of no very great compass or cultivation, but singularly sweet and touching, and she finally obtained position in a church choir. She held it for 3 months, greatly to her pecuniary advantage, and, it is said, much to the satisfaction of the gentlemen in the back pews who faced toward her during the singing of the last hymn. I remember her quite distinctly at this time. The light that slanted through the oriel of St. Dives's choir was wont to fall very tenderly on her beautiful head, with its stacked masses of deerskin-colored hair, on the low black arches of her brows, and to deepen the pretty fringes that shaded her eyes of Genoa velvet. Very pleasant it was to watch the opening and shutting of that small straight mouth, with its quick revelation of little white teeth, and to see the foolish blood faintly deepen her satin cheek as you watched. For Mrs. Tretherick was very sweetly conscious of admiration, and, like most pretty women, gathered herself under your eye like a racer under the spur. And then, of course, there came trouble. I have it from the soprano, a little lady who possessed even more than the usual unprejudiced judgment of her sex, that Mrs. Tretherick's conduct was simply shameful, that her conceit was unbearable, and if she considered the rest of the choir as slaves, she, the soprano, would like to know it, that her conduct on Easter Sunday with the basso had attracted the attention of the whole congregation, and that she herself had noticed Dr. Cope twice look up during the service, that her, the soprano's friends, had objected to her singing in the choir with a person who had been on the stage, but she had waived this. Yet she had it from the best authority that Mrs. Tretherick had run away from her husband, and that this red-haired child who sometimes came in the choir was not her own. The tenor confided to me behind the organ that Mrs. Tretherick had a way of sustaining a note at the end of a line in order that her voice might linger longer with the congregation, an act that could be attributed only to a defective moral nature. That as a man, he was a very popular dry goods clerk on weekdays and sang a good deal from apparently behind his eyebrows on the Sabbath. That as a man, sir, he would put up with it no longer. The basso alone, a short German with a heavy voice for which he seemed reluctantly responsible and rather grieved at its possession, stood up for Mrs. Tretherick, and averred that they were jealous of her because she was pretty. The climax was at last reached in an open quarrel, wherein Mrs. Tretherick used her tongue with such precision of statement and epithet that the soprano burst into hysterical tears and had to be supported from the choir by her husband and the tenor. This act was marked intentionally to the congregation by the omission of the usual soprano solo. Mrs. Tretherick went home flushed with triumph, but on reaching her room frantically told Carrie that they were beggars henceforward, that she, her mother, had just taken the very bread out of her darling's mouth, and ended by bursting into a flood of penitent tears. They did not come so quickly as in her old poetical days, but when they came, they stung deeply. She was roused by a formal visit from a vestryman, one of the music committee. Mrs. Tretherick dried her long lashes, put on a new neck ribbon, and went down to the parlor. She stayed there 2 hours, a fact that might have occasioned some remark, but that the vestryman was married and had a family of grown-up daughters. When Mrs. Tretherick returned to her room, she sang to herself in the glass and scolded Carrie, but she retained her place in the choir. It was not long, however. In due course of time, her enemies received a powerful addition to their forces in the committeeman's wife. That lady called upon several of the church members and on Dr. Cope's family. The result was that, at a later meeting of the music committee, Mrs. Tretherick's voice was declared inadequate to the size of the building, and she was invited to resign. She did so. She had been out of a situation for 2 weeks, and her scant means were almost exhausted, when Ah Fe's unexpected treasure was tossed into her lap. The gray fog deepened into night, and the street lamps started into shivering life as, absorbed in these unprofitable memories, Mrs. Tretherick still sat drearily at her window. Even Carrie had slipped away unnoticed, and her abrupt entrance with the damp evening paper in her hand roused Mrs. Tretherick and brought her back to an active realization of the present. For Mrs. Tretherick was wont to scan the advertisements in the faint hope of finding some avenue of employment, she knew not what, open to her needs, and Carrie had noted the habit. Mrs. Tretherick mechanically closed the shutters, lit the lights, and opened the paper. Her eye fell instinctively on the following paragraph in the telegraphic column. Fiddletown, 7th. Mr. James Tretherick, an old resident of this place, died last night of delirium tremens. Mr. Tretherick was addicted to intemperate habits, said to have been induced by domestic trouble. Mrs. Tretherick did not start. She quietly turned over another page of the paper and glanced at Carrie. The child was absorbed in a book. Mrs. Tretherick uttered no word, but during the remainder of the evening was unusually silent and cold. When Carrie was undressed and in bed, Mrs. Tretherick suddenly dropped on her knees behind the bed and, taking Carrie's flaming head between her hands, said, "Should you like to have another papa, Carrie, darling?" "No," said Carrie after a moment's thought. "But a papa to help Mama take care of you, to love you, to give you nice clothes, to make a lady of you when you grow up." Carrie turned her sleepy eyes toward the questioner. "Should you, Mama?" Mrs. Tretherick suddenly flashed to the roots of her hair. "Go to sleep," she said sharply, and turned away. But at midnight the child felt 2 white arms close tightly around her and was drawn down into a bosom that heaved, fluttered, and at last was broken up by sobs. "Don't cry, Mama," whispered Carrie with a vague retrospect of their recent conversation. "Don't cry. I think I should like a new papa, if he loved you very much. Very, very much." A month afterward, to everybody's astonishment, Mrs. Tretherick was married. The happy bridegroom was one Colonel Starbottle, recently elected to represent Calaveras County in the legislative councils of the state. As I cannot record the event in finer language than that used by the correspondent of the Sacramento Globe, I venture to quote some of his graceful periods. "The relentless shafts of the sly god have been lately busy among our gallant salons. We quote one more unfortunate. The latest victim is the Honorable C. Starbottle, Calaveras. The fair enchantress in the case is a beautiful widow, a former votary of Thespis, and lately a fascinating Saint Cecilia of one of the most fashionable churches of San Francisco, where she commanded a high salary." The Dutch Flat Intelligencer saw fit, however, to comment upon the fact with that humorous freedom characteristic of an unfettered press. "The new Democratic warhorse from Calaveras has lately adventured in the legislature with a little bill to change the name of Tretherick to Starbottle. They call it a marriage certificate down there. Mr. Tretherick has been dead just 1 month, but we presume the gallant colonel is not afraid of ghosts." It is but just to Mrs. Tretherick to state that the colonel's victory was by no means an easy one. To a natural degree of coyness on the part of the lady was added the impediment of a rival, a prosperous undertaker from Sacramento who had first seen and loved Mrs. Tretherick at the theater and church, his professional habits debarring him from ordinary social intercourse, and indeed any other than the most formal public contact with the sex. As this gentleman had made a snug fortune during the felicitous prevalence of a severe epidemic, the colonel regarded him as a dangerous rival. Fortunately, however, the undertaker was called in professionally to lay out a brother senator who had unhappily fallen by the colonel's pistol in an affair of honor, and either deterred by physical consideration from rivalry, or wisely concluding that the colonel was professionally valuable, he withdrew from the field. The honeymoon was very brief, and brought to a close by an untoward incident. During their bridal trip, Carrie had been placed in the charge of Colonel Starbottle's sister. On their return to the city, immediately on reaching their lodgings, Mrs. Starbottle announced her intention of at once proceeding to Mrs. Culpepper's to bring the child home. Colonel Starbottle, who had been exhibiting for some time a certain uneasiness which he had endeavored to overcome by repeated stimulation, finally buttoned his coat tightly across his breast, and after walking unsteadily once or twice up and down the room, suddenly faced his wife with his most imposing manner. "I have deferred," said the colonel, with an exaggeration of port that increased with his inward fear, and a growing thickness of speech. "I have deferred, I may say, postponed statement of fact that's my duty to disclose to you. I did not wish to mar sunshine, mutual happiness, to blind but a promise to darken conjugal sky by unpleasant revelation. Must be done. By God, ma'am, must do it now. The child is gone." "Gone?" echoed Mrs. Starbottle. There was something in the tone of her voice, in the sudden drawing together of the pupils of her eyes, that for a moment nearly sobered the colonel, and partly collapsed his chest. "I'll explain all in a minute," he said, with a deprecating wave of the hand. "Everything shall be explained. The melancholy event which precipitate our happiness, the mysterious province which release you. Release child, understand? Release child. The moment Tretherick died, all claim you have in child through him died too. That's law. Whose child belong to? Tretherick? Tretherick dead. Child can't belong to dead man. Damn nonsense belong dead man. It's your child? No. Whose child then? Child belong to his mother. You understand? "Where is she?" said Mrs. Starbottle, with a very white face and a very low voice. "I'll explain all. Child belongs to his mother. That's law. I'm lawyer, legislature, and American citizen. It's my duty as a lawyer, as legislature, and American citizen to restore a child to suffering mother at any cost. Any cost." "Where is she?" repeated Mrs. Starbottle, with her eyes still fixed on the colonel's face. "Gone to his mother. Gone east on the steamer yesterday. Wafted by favoring gales to suffering parent. That's so." Mrs. Starbottle did not move. The colonel felt his chest slowly collapsing, but steadied himself against a chair, and endeavored to beam with chivalrous gallantry, not unmixed with magisterial firmness, upon her as she sat. "Your feelings, ma'am, do honor to your sex, but consider situation. Consider mother's feelings. Consider my feelings." The colonel paused, and flourishing a white handkerchief, placed it negligently in his breast, and then smiled tenderly above it, as over laces and ruffles on the woman before him. "Why should dark shudder cast blind on two souls with single beat? Child's fine child, good child, but someone else's child. Child's gone, Clara. But all isn't gone, Clara.
Consider this. Y'alls have me."
Mrs. Starbottle started to her feet. "You!" she cried, bringing out a chest note that made the chandeliers ring. "You that I married to give my darling food and clothes? You! A dog that I whistled to my side to keep the men off me? You!" She choked up and then dashed past him into the inner room, which had been Carrie's. Then she swept by him again into her own bedroom, and then suddenly reappeared before him, erect, menacing, with a burning fire over her cheekbones, a quick straightening of her arched brows and mouth, a squaring of jaw, an ophidian flattening of the head. "Listen," she said in a hoarse, half-grown boy's voice. "Hear me. If you ever expect to set eyes on me again, you must find the child. If you ever expect to speak to me again, to touch me, you must bring her back. For where she goes, I go. You hear me? Where she has gone, look for me." She struck out past him again with a quick feminine throwing out of her arms from the elbows down, as if freeing herself from some imaginary bonds, and dashing into her chamber, slammed and locked the door. Colonel Starbottle, although no coward, stood in superstitious fear of an angry woman, and recoiling as she swept by, lost his unsteady foothold and rolled helplessly on the sofa. Here, after one or two unsuccessful attempts to regain his foothold, he remained, uttering from time to time profane but not entirely coherent or intelligible protests, until at last he succumbed to the exhausting quality of his emotions, and the narcotic quantity of his potations. Meantime, within, Mrs. Starbottle was excitedly gathering her valuables and packing her trunk, even as she had done once before in the course of this remarkable history. Perhaps some recollection of this was in her mind, for she stopped to lean her burning cheeks upon her hand as if she saw again the figure of the child standing in the doorway, and heard once more a childish voice asking, "Is it Mamma?" But the epithet now stung her to the quick, and with a quick passionate gesture she dashed it away with a tear that had gathered in her eye. And then it chanced that, in turning over some clothes, she came upon the child's slipper with a broken sandal string. She uttered a great cry here, the first she had uttered, and caught it to her breast, kissing it passionately again and again, and rocking from side to side with a motion peculiar to her sex. And then she took it to the window, the better to see it through her now streaming eyes. Here she was taken with a sudden fit of coughing that she could not stifle with the handkerchief she put to her feverish lips. And then she suddenly grew very faint. The window seemed to recede before her, the floor to sink beneath her feet, and staggering to the bed, she fell prone upon it with the sandal and handkerchief pressed to her breast. Her face was quite pale, the orbit of her eyes dark, and there was a spot upon her lip, another on her handkerchief, and still another on the white counterpane of the bed. The wind had risen, rattling the window sashes and swaying the white curtains in a ghostly way. Later a gray fog stole softly over the roofs, soothing the wind-roughened surfaces and enwrapping all things in an uncertain light and a measureless peace. She lay there very quiet, for all her troubles still a very pretty bride. On the other side of the bolted door, the gallant bridegroom, from his temporary couch, snored peacefully. A week before Christmas Day, 1870, the little town of Genoa, in the state of New York, exhibited, perhaps more strongly than at any other time, the bitter irony of its founders and sponsors. A driving snowstorm that had whitened every windward hedge, bush, wall, and telegraph pole, played around this soft Italian capital, whirled in and out of the great staring wooden Doric columns of its post office and hotel, beat upon the cold green shutters of its best houses, and powdered the angular, stiff, dark figures in its streets. From the level of the street, the four principal churches of the town stood out starkly, even while their misshapen spires were kindly hidden in the low, driving storm. Near the railroad station, the new Methodist chapel, whose resemblance to an enormous locomotive was further heightened by the addition of a pyramidal row of front steps, like a cow-catcher, stood as if waiting for a few more houses to be hitched on to proceed to a pleasanter location. But the pride of Genoa, the great Cramer Institute for Young Ladies, stretched its bare brick lengths and reared its cupola plainly from the bleak Parnassian hill above the principal avenue. There was no evasion in the Cramer Institute of the fact that it was a public institution. A visitor upon its doorsteps, a pretty face at its window, were clearly visible all over the township. The shriek of the engine of the 4 o'clock Northern Express brought but few of the usual loungers to the depot. Only a single passenger alighted, and it was driven away in the solitary waiting sleigh toward the Genoa Hotel. And then the train sped away again, with that passionless indifference to human sympathies or curiosity peculiar to express trains. The one baggage truck was wheeled into the station again. The station door was locked, and the station master went home. The locomotive whistle, however, awakened the guilty consciousness of 3 young ladies of the Cramer Institute, who were even then surreptitiously regaling themselves in the bake-shop and confectionery saloon of Mistress Phillips in a by-lane. For even the admirable regulations of the Institute failed to entirely develop the physical and moral natures of its pupils. They conformed to the excellent dietary rules in public, and in private drew upon the luxurious rations of their village caterer. They attended church with exemplary formality, and flirted informally during service with the village beau. They received the best and most judicious instruction during school hours, and devoured the trashiest novels during recess, the result of which was an aggregation of quite healthy, quite human, and very charming young creatures that reflected infinite credit on the Institute. Even Mistress Phillips, to whom they owed vast sums, exhilarated by the exuberant spirits and youthful freshness of her guests, declared that the sight of them young things did her good, and had even been known to shield them by shameless equivocation. 4 o'clock, girls, and if we're not back to prayers by 5, we'll be missed, said the tallest of these foolish virgins, with an aquiline nose and certain quiet élan that bespoke the leader, as she rose from her seat. "Have you got the books, Addie?" Addie displayed 3 dissipated-looking novels under her waterproof. "And the provisions, Carrie?" Carrie showed a suspicious parcel filling the pocket of her sack. "All right, then. Come, girls, trudge. Charge it," she added, noting to her host as they passed toward the door. "I'll pay you when my quarter's allowance comes." "No, Kate," interposed Carrie, producing her purse. "Let me pay. It's my turn." "Never!" said Kate, arching her black brows loftily. "Even if you do have rich relatives and regular remittances from California, never. Come, girls, forward march!" As they opened the door, a gust of wind nearly took them off their feet. Kind-hearted Mrs. Phillips was alarmed. "Sakes alive, gals, you mustn't go out in such weather. Better let me send word to the Institute and make you up a nice bed tonight in my parlor." But the last sentence was lost in a chorus of half-suppressed shrieks as the girls, hand in hand, ran down the steps into the storm, and were at once whirled away. The short December day, unlit by any unusual glow, was failing fast. It was quite dark already, and the air was thick with driving snow. For some distance their high spirits, youth, and even inexperience kept them bravely up, but in ambitiously attempting a short cut from the high road across an open field, their strength gave out, the laugh grew less frequent, and tears began to stand in Carrie's brown eyes. When they reached the road again, they were utterly exhausted. "Let's go back," said Carrie. "We'd never get across that field again," said Addie. "Let's stop at the first house, then," said Carrie. "The first house," said Addie, peering through the gathering darkness, "is Squire Robinson's." She darted a mischievous glance at Carrie that even in her discomfort and fear brought the quick blood to her cheek. "Oh, yes," said Kate with gloomy irony. "Certainly. Stop at the Squire's by all means, and be invited to tea, and be driven home after by your dear friend Mr. Harry, with a formal apology from Mrs. Robinson, and hopes that the young ladies may be excused this time." "No," continued Kate with sudden energy. "That may suit you, but I'm going back as I came, by the window, or not at all." Then she pounced suddenly like a hawk on Carrie, who was betraying a tendency to sit down on a snowbank and whimper, and shook her briskly. "You'll be going to sleep next." "Stay, hold your tongues, all of you. What's that? It was the sound of sleigh bells. Coming down toward them out of the darkness was a sleigh with a single occupant. "Hold down your head, girls. If it's anybody that knows us, we're lost." But it was not, for a voice strange to their ears, but withal very kindly and pleasant, asked if its owner could be of any help to them. As they turned toward him, they saw it was a man wrapped in a handsome sealskin cloak, wearing a sealskin cap. His face, half concealed by a muffler of the same material, disclosing only a pair of long mustaches and 2 keen dark eyes. "It's the son of old Santa Claus," whispered Addie. The girls tittered audibly as they tumbled into the sleigh. They had regained their former spirits. "Where shall I take you?" said the stranger quietly. There was a hurried whispering, and then Kate said boldly, "To the Institute." They drove silently up the hill until the long, ascetic building loomed up before them. The stranger reined up suddenly.
"Well, you know the way better than I do," he said. "Where do you go in?"
"Through the back window," said Kate, with sudden and appalling frankness.
"I see,"
responded the strange driver quietly, and alighting quickly, removing the bells from the horses.
"We can drive as near as you please now,"
he added by way of explanation.
"He certainly is a son of Santa Claus," whispered Addie. "Hadn't we better ask after his father?"
"Hush!" said Kate decidedly. "He is an angel, I dare say." She added with a delicious irrelevance, which was, however, perfectly understood by her feminine auditors, "We are looking like 3 frights." Cautiously skirting the fences, they at last pulled up a few feet from a dark wall. The stranger proceeded to assist them to alight. There was still some light from the reflected snow, and as he handed his fair companions to the ground, each was conscious of undergoing an intense, though respectful scrutiny. He assisted them gravely to open the window, and then discreetly retired to the sleigh until the difficult and somewhat discomposing ingress was made. He then walked to the window.
"Thank you, and good night,"
whispered 3 voices. A single figure still lingered. The stranger leaned over the window-sill.
"Will you permit me to light my cigar here?
It might attract attention if I struck a match outside." By the uprising light, he saw the figure of Kate very charmingly framed in by the window. The match burnt slowly out in his fingers.
Kate smiled mischievously.
The astute young woman had detected the pitiable subterfuge. For what else did she stand at the head of her class, and had doting parents paid 3 years' tuition? The storm had passed, and the sun was shining quite cheerily in the eastern recitation room the next morning, when Miss Kate, whose seat was nearest the window, placing her hand pathetically upon her heart, affected to fall in bashful and extreme agitation upon the shoulder of Carrie, her neighbor.
"He has come,"
she gasped in a thrilling whisper.
"Who?"
asked Carrie sympathetically, who never clearly understood when Kate was in earnest.
"Who? Why, the man who rescued us last night. I saw him drive to the door this moment. Don't speak. I shall be better in a moment."
"Ah, there," she said, and the shameless hypocrite passed her hand pathetically across her forehead with a tragic air.
"What can he want?"
asked Carrie, whose curiosity was excited.
"I don't know,"
said Kate, suddenly relapsing into gloomy cynicism.
"Possibly to put his 5 daughters to school. Perhaps to finish his young wife and warn her against us. He didn't look old, and he didn't seem like a married man,"
rejoined Addie thoughtfully.
"That was his art, you poor creature," returned Kate scornfully. "You can never tell anything of these men. They're so deceitful. Besides, it's just my fate."
"Why, Kate," began Carrie in serious concern.
"Hush! Miss Walker is saying something,"
said Kate, laughing.
"The young ladies will please give attention," said a slow, perfunctory voice. "Miss Carrie Tretherick is wanted in the parlor."
End of Part 3.